Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Fusion Strike, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our pre-Fusion Strike tier list. We've played a good number of games on tabletop. We've played some IRL as well with the new archetypes. So today we're going to be talking about where we think they place in the meta and how we think the current decks in the format will be adapting and changing to accommodate for the new decks.
Yeah, so we're going to start off with some of the Fusion Strike decks, and then we'll move into some of the decks that we've seen do well over the past few months. I think I'll start off with the Inteleon, the Rapid Strike Inteleon deck. This is one of the more interesting archetypes, and I think we're going to place it in around the 1.5 tier to kick things off. Basically, it becomes the new best Cheryl user, we think. Obviously, decks like Jolteon have been the Cheryl decks, but they've played a low count. This new Inteleon deck looks to play the full 4 count of Cheryl and basically become this tanking archetype, but that also can apply pressure here and there with Inteleon pings and get into sort of the VMAX levels of damage across a couple of turns. It's a bit awkward compared to some of the other Inteleon decks. Usually you'll pair this with the other one prize Inteleon to help tutor out cards. Basically, all of your damage is kind of front loaded. There's no real gusting or anything in the deck because you're using Cheryl every turn, which can sometimes, be a detriment in comparison to something like a Jolteon, which has really a real wide range of damage you can do. But the Jolteon takes a few turns, whereas the Inteleon has a bit more damage, sort of upfront and in the face of some of these other VMAXs, which is pretty good. Basically, all of the decks that can one-shot it, you're going to be kind of worrying about, but a lot of the decks that look to two-shot, things like the Dragapults, even the Jolteons to a certain extent, but some stuff like Leafeon and stuff like that, all of these kind of old Inteleon decks, we think are going to struggle somewhat against Inteleon just because it can Cheryl away the damage and really try and just out-resource people. You also get to play a really low energy count, which means you get to play quite a thick Inteleon engine from Sword and Shield, and on top of that, a lot of cool like one-off trainers here and there that can really spin matchups in your favor as well. So yeah, a really interesting archetype. We don't think it's quite up to tier 1 just because there are a lot of one-shot decks about going forward, but it's definitely a very, very tanky deck and looks to be a really good partner for Urshi as well when we start talking about Rapid Strike Urshi too.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get Mew VMAX out the way because I know a lot of people are excited for this archetype and we're sold on it. We think this will be a tier S deck. We think it has enough draw to be one of the most consistent decks in the game. It has great opening outs as well because you have Quick Ball, Fog Crystal, as well as Capture Energy. So you get on the board quickly. You go wide with the list, get lots of Genesects into play, draw a ton of cards. So you have good combo pop-off potential where you have some silly turns, but you also just have some nice, like, steady defensive options where you have Energy Mixer and Lesser Sparkle to deal with, like, fans and hammers and that sort of thing. So you get energies into play all over the place. You have a backup 2-prize attacker in Genesect, which is expensive, but can be useful here and there to skew a prize race. And you also have the likes of Latias that you can see on the slide, and even the option to Psycho Jump back into the deck to undo damage from the opponent and also wall at the same time. So even though you only have like a handful of Pokemon to copy, Mew seems versatile enough to prove difficult for like a ton of new decks. And we believe that with the other cards that are out in Fusion Strike, we can defend against even some of the more awkward matchups that we're expecting. Obviously, there are some dark decks out there that can one-hit KO Mew quite easily, especially the new Gengar coming out. But if that does become like one of the biggest checks or answers, we could even see things like Huntail coming into the list to defend against that. You could see even things like Fan of Waves coming into the Mew deck because you have tutoring from Peony, most likely. I know there is a bit of debate right now on what the best way to build Mew is, so I think that coming to light will be a really interesting sort of development as people go like full turbo. People are sticking to traditional supporters like Researcher Marnie that we know are fantastic, and then there's the option for Peony for like pop-off potential where you can spam tablets or cross switches or other plays like that. Personally, I still like Peony. I think it will be successful alongside Mew, but that's sort of to be seen right now. But regardless, we think Mew has the power, the consistency, and like the versatility to challenge pretty much any deck in the format right now.
Definitely. I'll take the other big Fusion Strike deck in Genesect Toxicity. This is going to be around, again, that 1.5 tier, I think. Basically, it's not as versatile as the Mew deck. In some instances, it's a bit more aggressive because you have power tablets and Toxicity to try and uptrade. But like, Mew can still kind of do the gusting and dealing with a 2-prizer on turn 2 as well. So it's not necessarily more aggressive. But the uptrading is kind of the selling point of the deck. Obviously, there's things like Saucer as well, and you could even play a combination of Saucer plus Sparkle to just get Genesect out of nowhere, which is also cool. Obviously, there's a little bit more inconsistent. There's more pieces to be gathered. It means that you have to build your deck slightly differently to the kind of the Mew builds. But even in these decks, we could even see kind of a combination of these two archetypes where you're playing some Toxtricities in Mew, where you're playing a thin Mew line in the Genesect deck. All of these kind of fusion cards are all so intersynergistic. There's definitely going to be some merit there. Like I say, we don't think it's got the versatility that Mew does, but just being able to draw so many cards and uptrade into VMAXs, I think you have to respect the aggression of the deck. And yeah, I think it's pretty solidly going to be 1.5. I think initially we thought it was maybe going to be a little bit higher, but on playing it, it has fallen down to that 1.5. But I still think it's not going to go much lower, just because, again, you draw so many cards with Genesect. It's kind of impossible to not be drawing into your answers consistently. So yeah, it's not quite Mew, but it's still incredibly good, I think.
Let's move on to one of my pet decks, a throwback to Mega Gardevoir, and that's going to be Serena. We actually profiled this just yesterday, and I know there was a lot of comments saying that they don't believe in the archetype, and it's one of those interesting ones where, because the Inteleon engine is like in all the successful decks, whenever you present someone a build which isn't an Inteleon engine, they're immediately skeptical. And Serena's damage output like isn't fantastic anyway. I think the main sort of like selling point Serena has at its disposal is its typing will be relevant into dealing with Mew, which I think is decent, and you just are a Cape of Toughness 2-prize Pokemon, and you just try and churn through in that regard. Again, you can take advantage of capture and that sort of thing. You can draw a lot of cards with Crobat. You have Eldegoss and Chatot to recover supporters. So you're relatively consistent, even though your deck plays like 20 Pokemon. You're like low maintenance and easy to get running. So it feels a little bit like a Suicune deck where you just jam pack a load of consistency cards into a list and just be low maintenance. So you just beat decks that draw badly in the opening turns. And the biggest selling point will be if Single Strike really kicks on, and specifically if the Gengar list overtakes the Urshifu list of Single Strike, because in that instance, Leafeon as a grass type attacking deck gets way less appealing because you have a terrible Gengar thanks to Hiding Darkness energies, and potentially even like Eternatus making a small resurgence with Hiding Darkness energy as an option as well. So having the typing of grass and just being low maintenance means that I think it could be a relevant deck. I don't think it's ever going to push into the higher tiers because the damage output is still a bit of an issue. There are some Cheryl users in here. Things like Urshifu, Jolteon, and Intel, the new Inteleon deck, can all play healing. Mew has inbuilt healing with Psycho Jump as well when it needs to, and is very good at dealing with 2-prize Pokemon, even with Cape of Toughness, because they have tablets. And they also have Old Cemetery, so all those things are a bit of an issue. So overall, love the engine. Think it's a ton of fun, and there's a ton of potential for future. But right now, I don't think it really breaks into those higher echelons just yet.
Yeah. I'm going to take Zoro Control, basically because Control looks to potentially be making its way back onto the tier list. We think it's going to be around tier 2. It doesn't feel anywhere near as oppressive as Control has in the past. Some of the negatives before we go into some of the positives. Mew can be a bit sketchy. We've seen a couple of lists over the past few days which have a really low energy count. You're going to body those, we feel, just because Mew can't take enough prizes. Mew can't take 6 prizes with 6 or 7 energy before you've hammered them away and stuff like that. But the list's running sort of 9, 10, 11 energy. That's where you're going to start to struggle, especially with the tempo of Mew. So that can be a bit awkward, depending on how Mew kind of settles, whether there's two camps of how to play Mew, or where that kind of lies will kind of dictate how good the Mew matchup is. But if we're expecting 10, even 15% of Mew, that could be a very big swing in or out of Zoro Control's favor. The Melanie decks are also kind of awkward, obviously, with recovery, being able to draw out of any potential kind of hand locks you're doing with things like Orbital and stuff, as well as not really running many special energy. So techs like Dusknoir and stuff aren't really helpful. Um, there's a lot, again, a lot of kind of awkwardness with some of these Melanie decks. So you'll see that we do have a couple of Melanie decks still in the higher tiers of the format. But there are a lot of matchups out there that aren't playing that aren't playing Melanies and that aren't Mew that we do think the Control finally has a chance against. I think this is the best position Control's been in probably since rotation, maybe even longer. I can't actually remember when there was a massively successful Control list outside of just Sander continually churning out new lists each week. But yeah, we've tested this, we've toyed around with it, and I think we're finally getting to the break point of controlling cards. We have things like Sydney and stuff in a format that is very heavily reliant on special energy. We have a couple of really cool techs in things like Huntail and Goribus now, and we have finally some recovery with Azumarill, or some consistent recovery with Azumarill, which can turn into a lot of flexibility with the Zoro Arc engine. So it's one of those where we don't think it's oppressive. We don't even necessarily think it's any higher than tier 2. But there will be people who go on runs who maybe just hit a couple of Mews, and outside of that, hit a lot of good matchups. I think it will somewhat depend on that kind of pendulum of how Mew finally settles down to be being played as to how consistently well the control lists will do. But in the world where it turns out the 6 or 7 energy lists work, I think control gains a massive uptick in terms of good matchups. You just at that point kind of worrying about the Melanie stuff. So yeah, it feels like it's also very flexible at the moment. There's a lot of stage 1s that have kind of just been waiting in the wings, things that you can try out, even some stage 2s that you can even shoehorn in just to try and get the stage 1 in, and then the stage 2 into play with Zoro Arc. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. We might finally be at that break point. We might still need another set or two of just random control-y cards here and there. But I think it's at least justifiable to play this now.
Yeah, I think so too. Toyed around with it a lot, and I think it's a good fun challenge at least to figure it out with all the new toys. Let's have a look at Gengar then, and Single Strike in general. We're actually going to put these in the same tier, and we still believe that this is potentially a tier 1 archetype. We like that Umbreon is one of the better checks to Mew in general. Obviously, Fusion Strike Energy can block the gusting from an Umbreon, but still your type coverage and your just raw hit points will prove difficult for the Mew-based builds and be a bit of an issue for them to overcome. And the Gengar build is sort of like the most punishing into the Mew matchup, and we think that's what really keeps it afloat. It's also just lower maintenance in its own right. Now, I know that you have to take capture energies out, or at least a number of your capture energies out of the list, which may be off-putting for some people because you're not really as consistent as a lot of the other Inteleon engines that sit around the top of the format, because you just don't have that supplementary ability to accept. Well, you get energy acceleration, but you don't get consistency and grabbing supporters and all that sort of stuff. So you're really just relying on researches, Crobats, and Tower of Darkness, and that's what puts people off Single Strike for the most part. But if you can just sort of see past that, see the power of Umbreon gusting, the power of the one-hit KOs that both Gengar and Urshifu can churn out, that's like the biggest selling points here. And we feel like Mew's a good enough deck that it deserves targeting, and I think that's what's going to keep Single Strike like pretty relevant. The lists themselves don't change like too much. You could just rock basically the same 60 of Urshifu Umbreon right now, and I think it would still be very relevant in the new format and good into the new Gengar matchup, ironically enough, because Gengar is weak to fighting. You'd be good into Mew because you have the element of the Umbreon, and good into the new Intel deck as well because you have one hit KO potential with one blow. So yeah, it is actually not too worried about the new decks coming out in the format. It has fallen off recently in online tournament results. Potentially down to Tord as well, sort of like downplaying the deck's success on his like Twitch and all that good stuff, saying that it's the best Intel, or like the best non-Inteleon deck, but what does that even mean in the format? So it's been trashed recently, and there's an uptick in Rapid Strike, which is one of the worst matchups for Single Strike. But Rapid Strike does have to be potentially concerned by Mew coming into the format as well, so maybe a little bit less of a safer play in the format. So that also bodes well for Single Strike overall. So it really came out the gates pretty quickly in the Evolving Skies meta, and I do think, the Evolving Skies meta, and I think it can continue to be a top tier deck going forward. I'm not a huge fan of Gengar, and I can foresee some playing around with the counts on a sort of weekly basis on tournament results, especially online, where you can just look back the week before or the last few days. You can see what's been the most popular decks, and you can tweak accordingly, where you go to like fit Gengar, thin Gengars, no Gengar, that sort of thing, just based on where the results are. And I think that's at least something interesting for single strike players. If you're currently a single strike player, you have a bit more flexibility now to adapt to a format rather than just like presenting the same 60 into the tournament no matter what. So that's also like a good thing to have, and it gives you more longevity going forward as a single strike player.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think Single Strike's the deck I've played the most in this format, but I haven't been changing my list, like, outside of maybe one card week in, week out. So there is, at least, like you say, some flexibility there. I am also not the biggest fan of Gengar, but I can see its merits, and I can definitely see myself still playing it, even if it's just a thin count, just because it does something kind of not completely different, but it just approaches in a different angle, which is pretty interesting. Let's take a quick look at Boltund Flaffy. We're going to drop this in 2.5. Basically, anything like 3, we would really not recommend playing. 2.5 is kind of, yeah, you're going to have fun, you're going to win some games, but they're not super competitive, and anything 2 upwards is where we would really consider them for a tournament. It sucks because I think Boltund is such a fun deck. I actually think it's a fantastic budget deck. I think it's a great new player deck. I think it teaches a lot about the game, and it should be relatively cheap as well. So for those aspects, I think it's a fantastic deck. I think it's a brilliant introduction to the TCG. So if you have friends that want to try it out, want to try out the TCG, I actually really do recommend the deck. Outside of that, it can win games. It can win games against almost anything, to be honest, because you only need 1 or 2 turns of basically not losing your energy to the point where you're even able to one-shot with Boltund, which is pretty crazy. The list we profiled was super high energy, but I've seen a couple of lists that were more low energy and leaning into the 3 energy attack on Boltund and just being kind of a tempo piece in the same way that some of these other VMAXs have been built. I've even seen, I can't remember where it was, but I even saw like a Boltund Inteleon list, which was kind of crazy. But yeah, it's a really interesting deck. I don't think it's going to be stealing the show particularly often. It may win a tournament here or there, but I think it can win games against a couple of basically anything that misses a turn or two. So really leaning into that Marnie, maybe even that is your primary win condition, maybe even bumping that up. But it's definitely a lot of fun, and like I say, I think it's really really good for the game that that we have a fun and accessible budget deck that isn't just like basically a theme deck. It can win games. You can take it to a tournament and not expect to completely be bombed out. It's fun, and it can like steal games here and there. So yeah, it's like a 2.5, nothing crazy, but at least it's a cheap one to try out, at least in the early weeks of Fusion Strike when everything's super expensive. The Boltons, basically the whole deck is available via old cards other than 3 VMAXs right now. So yeah, really accessible. Not hyper competitive, but not by any means a joke at all.
Absolutely. Let's go on to Greedant VMAX. I think Greedant's a super interesting card. I think the shine has sort of gone away from Greedant now. I think there was initial hype where we're like, oh my god, so many prizes you can take in a turn. But the damage output is challenging enough that it's not just like given to you on a platter for those free prizes. You do have to work for it. I think we're going to bundle this alongside Suicune in at tier 2. Really because we're still expecting a ton of Houndour and a ton of Sobble engines around, and that's kind of what you're trying to prey on as this sort of Suicune Inteleon deck, almost like subbing out the Ice Rider parts and just throwing in like a 2/2 Greedant package, and then a number of Echoing Horns and the toy catchers as you see fit, like a 1/1 of each of those cards, or like 2/2 even on the item side. Could be pretty interesting. Also, powerful color synergies can buff your damage output that little bit more. Put yourself into like 50 damage realms where you only need 1 ping or 1 Zigzagoon, that sort of thing, to deal with Sobbles. You do potentially have like turn 2 high roll of getting, going first, attaching to Greedant, turn 2 evolving up and just dealing with a Sobble quite easily, especially if you are playing those powerful colorless and Zigzagoon, which would be like very, very dangerous to deal with, because then even into the next turn you could use his second attack to do 160 and set up that Suicune for game on a VMAX. So there are some scary things when you go first with this deck. It can be awkward, and also just Suicune Tempo in general is just like so good. Suicune is just like a good enough card alongside Inteleon that you can win some games just because you're attacking turn 2 of Suicune and it's like good tempo and the Greedant doesn't even matter at times. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. You can also play around with your own damage with Suicune. When you're in other 2-prizer matchups, you can put yourself just out of range with the Blizzard Rondo so that then you can big stocks a 2-prize Pokemon for a KO. As long as they're not an evolving V, of course. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff to go alongside Greedant, but I think it's challenging enough that it's not going to be like oppressive or broken. I think there'll actually be an annoying number of games where you try and win with Greedant and you have to take 4 prizes anyway. So like the 2 prizes that you gain really is only a 1 additional prize that you could gain. And you could gain that advantage by playing other Suicune builds anyway. So yeah, you're jumping through hoops to do something really cool. And sometimes it will feel very, very good. And sometimes it's like, why am I playing these like 6 cards or 8 cards, that sort of thing. Just for the memes for the most part, I think.
Yeah. So that's the majority of the new decks. I'll knock off a couple of the very, very low tier decks. Decidueye and Duraludon, we still think are pretty bad calls right now. Basically, I think these have proved that they weren't particularly good in the Evolving Skies meta, but these are kind of decks that always have a bit of a cult following and, have a lot of diehard fans behind them. Obviously, you will steal games with both of these decks because they are naturally walling decks in their own right. But we think there's so many ins and outs and ways you can get around these walls and different sort of engines and stuff that get around Decidueye or get around the Duraludon, even things like more Path to the Peaks and stuff. There's so many hoops these various decks have to jump through. It feels like you're just better off playing something like a Boltund or something to just kind of have a bit more fun and trying to dodge and weave all these different answers. There's still, again, so many Inteleon decks, so many Path to the Peak decks, and even then, it feels like both of these decks are still pretty inconsistent anyway. So, yeah, nothing has really changed since Evolving Skies, almost to the point where it wasn't even worth adding these. But again, we know that there are so many people who are just kind of diehard fans or cult followers. We didn't want to completely leave them off, but yeah, it just still feels like there's not a particularly good time for these kind of pure warding decks because there's just so many answers to them right now.
Yep, continuing on the sort of like less playable train, but maybe a little bit more than these walling decks. We'll go for Togekiss Inteleon. People, again, kind of gravitate towards this sort of deck because you have some good tutoring and you already have the Intel engine to sort of be consistent. You have some healing ability as well, and there's also a new Dunsparce from the set that can remove your lightning weakness. Not that there was like a huge amount of Jolteon presence that was ruining Togekiss necessarily, but it's something to potentially bear in mind for future. I think it's just proven itself to be slightly weaker than a lot of the other Intel builds in the game. You don't have the same sniping pressure. You sometimes fail to even two-shot things, so the damage output is just still so low. And ultimately, the cards that you're like tutoring out with Togekiss, you can almost tutor out the entire deck anyway, just with the Inteleon pieces. So you're kind of just like doubling down on something that you can already do pretty well. One thing I actually heard just on the grapevine is that you could try and add in like Greedant into this list as well for like more combo potential, because again, the Togekiss is like cherry picking some pieces out of the deck the entire time, and you can try and make that package work that little bit easier, especially if you're playing like Melanie for acceleration and you already play 4 powerful colorless. So maybe some intrigue there, but I think outside of that, it's just more experimental for now.
Yeah. Let's take a look at what should we go for? We'll take a look at another Suicune build. Suicune Ludicolo, we still think is pretty good, even all the way to the point where we want to put it in tier 1. Basically, this was the big surprise of Evolving Skies, and whilst it kind of has ebbed and flowed in its popularity, I still think it's pretty solid. I think naturally things got a little bit awkward when Dragapult started to rise, just because it meant that your Lotads were a little bit more at risk. But we think Dragapult is taking a little bit more of a backseat, not necessarily a particularly large backseat, but it's dropping down the tiers a little bit, which I think means that your Lotads all of a sudden feel a lot safer, which is great because basically that's the backbone of the deck against some of these VMAX matchups, and it can still do the exact same things as it could in these VMAX matchups. Being able to push into the one shot on VMAX is really, really good. Mew has 310 HP, which is already lower than the normal amount for these VMAXs, but also they want to go wide anyway, so they're already boosting your damage, which is great. And naturally, some of the single strike matchups have been particularly Suicune favored anyway. So we still think there's a lot of matchups that really Suicune likes to see at the moment. I think the rise of Urshifu is a little bit spooky, just because again it kind of puts your Lotads under threat. Rapid Strike Urshifu I'm on about. It kind of puts them under threat a little bit more again. But I still think there are a lot of merits here. We know how good of a tempo piece Suicune is, and the fact that there's more, well, there's still a lot of VMAXs right now, as well as a new one that looks to be a very, very high tier that has a lower HP threshold than some of the others, is really, really good for your natural prize mapping, as well as just being not a VMAX, so they can't be immune against you. And obviously, they have access to being able to heal themselves. But if you're able to at least take one big KO, you can kind of then start bossing around and taking these extra other 3 prizes. So yeah, I think the Suicune deck is still very, very solid. I think there's a couple of matchups that obviously things like Mew will force you to be honest and force a lot of tempo out of you, but I think the matchup is definitely winnable. And I think that's one of the key things, is going to be one of the key things going forward. Just making sure that you're able to keep up in tempo. And I think with Ludicolo, you definitely are.
Yeah, let's actually talk about Urshifu Melanie, because it's kind of like the new hot deck, and I've actually tested like a good amount of this over the last like couple weeks since it really came to light. And man, in the Evolving Skies format, it is absolutely cracked. I think it's actually like super, super good, because you're just like a better Inteleon deck than all the other Inteleon decks, and that's like almost all the format. The one thing you do have to be concerned about in the format is the rise of Mew being another psychic type Pokemon. More worrying than Dragapult, because they have that one hit KO potential on turn 2, a lot of tempo. And they also have Fusion Strike Energy, which can render your Inteleon pings useless as well. And sometimes those are really relevant for fixing math for you with your rapid flow game plan. That said, they will put a lot of 2 prize Pokemon in play for you, or the Genesects with fairly low hit points. So trying to bundle into those over a few turns with your telescopics and that sort of thing could still be on the table. But I think in general, you'll just get mopped up by the Mew that little bit too easily. So I think we're going to see a small adaptation of Melanie Urshifu. I still think the selling points of Urshi are there. So like keeping a 3-2 line of Urshifu in there seems relevant, but then also working in the new Inteleon that we can see down here in the sort of quad Inteleon. I can easily see like a 2-2 package going into Urshifu right now. We know that currently in Melanie Fu there is the 1-1 Vaporeon Rapid Striker, and I think Inteleon fits the bill that little bit better and allows you to have an option against Mew to actually try and win the game. Your damage output still isn't like fantastic into them, and you're still worried about them jumping into the deck and that sort of thing, and you can still get blown up by power tablets. But I think it's a better defense than just having Vaporeon that's just kind of too expensive to get working in the first place, and you always want prerequisite damage on Mews, which can't happen when they're blocking Inteleon pings with their Fusion Strike Energy. So I just think naturally the Inteleon's going to be a better choice here, the VMAX over Vaporeon. But yeah, I'm like completely sold on Urshifu. I think it's very good into the single strike matchups. I think it's very good into like basically every other Inteleon deck as well. So it has been like super strong in the Evolving Skies format, and I think Mew is a challenge for you, and that's why we're not putting it. We're sort of putting it at the lower end of tier 1, but we still think it is like so good into the traditional decks that if they all stay around in some capacity, you're going to be farming them and figuring out as you go against Mew. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for you.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Leafeon. We mentioned it earlier on how kind of there might be this tug of war between which grass deck is better. We think Leafeon is going to end up in tier 2 as well, but I think we're kind of agreed that it will be slightly lower in tier 2 overall. Basically, going into Evolving Skies, we said Leafeon seemed pretty good and potentially rising based on the amount of Umbreon seeing play. Now we think it's tier 2, which is kind of where it was at the start of this format, but probably declining. We mentioned earlier on how the Gengar build gets to play Hiding Energy if they're going on the heavy Gengar side, which basically renders the Leafeons useless because they can also protect their Umbreons. Mew naturally has free retreat, so even with a stadium that they can very easily bounce because they want to be playing lots anyway, you're capping at 120. Already 2 of these new matchups are really awkward. Moving down into 1.5, Inteleon looks to heal. You're going to struggle to one-shot them anyway, so they're going to be able to out-resource you outside of just kind of mining them into nothing, which isn't going to happen very often, with provided they can get things like Octillery online. And then Genesect, again, is probably going to be able to uptrade into you quite consistently. They also have resistance on you, so even you have to be able to get the stadium out. Even with their low HP, you still need the stadium to ever be getting into the one-shot range, which again, they're going to be playing lots of counters to because they don't want to be pathed. So all like the new big four decks are all pretty awkward matchups, which is why we think it's going to see probably a decline in play. The reason why it's still 2 is just because there are still going to be, we think, natural single strikes about that you're going to be able to feast on. And again, naturally, we've mentioned in the past how Leafeon just kind of keeps decks honest. And it still does keep a lot of these decks, things like the Dragapults and stuff like that, somewhat honest anyway. So it's not like terrible, but it looks like it's going into a much more hazier field going forward. And I think we would have to see a serious overhype of things like Inteleon, and maybe even Genesect, maybe even Gengar and Mew for the Leafeon builds to be more favorable again. So it's one of those where maybe in the early weeks, it's still okay because of people are still going to be adapting their old lists, but only for the first couple of weeks before people finally have access to Mews and Gengars and Inteleons and stuff. That's when it's really going to start. It's really going to start to feel painful playing the Leafeon deck.
Yeah, let's talk about the reverse actually of an archetype that's sort of been out of favor, but now has an extra look into the format potentially because of its type coverage against Mew, and that's going to be Eternatus. Once sort of the big bad of the format upon its release, it's really fallen way out of favor, partly because of the amount of Path of the Peak, partly because Crobat is such a liability with all of these spreading decks, and those are still issues for Eternatus, so we don't think it's going to be climbing hugely. But we think it's maybe a consideration again in the format, in at tier 2. Probably not ever breaking into those top 10 decks, because there is still a good element of fighting. Even Gengar builds can play Urshifu. Our build plays one at least. There's still Single Strike and even potentially Rapid Strike Urshifu around, so it's not like fighting's completely gone, but you can at least be hitting into Mew aggressively, turn 2, that sort of thing. And you have that tempo on your side, you have that draw on your side. And if people are playing Mew decks, they're obviously not playing Path in their Mew builds. So that means there's, in theory, maybe a little bit less Path around. And we also think that the likes of Jolteon and Dragapult are still going to be playing Path, obviously, but we think they're maybe a little bit worse footing than they are right now in the format. So maybe that opens up the door for Eternatus, where the weaknesses, the cracks that you have to cover up are less prevalent, and you can maybe get the job done just into this Mew matchup and give you enough of a benefit. Obviously, you're still terrified about Suicune as well, and there's a lot of things going against you. You're worried about Gentox even, because your huge hit points is one of the things you're trying to lean into as much as possible, as well as your turn 2 tempo. But yeah, I think overall there's actually a reason to play Eternatus again. So just worth a mention. We still think there will be Path, and we still think there are issues with Eternatus's type coverage on his own end. Also, just quick note about the Fusion Strike Hooper from the set. People are saying this could be a Dark Psychic Pokemon you could add into Eternatus to help your type coverage. I personally don't think it's worth the space because you end up having to play like 3-4 E-Switch alongside the Moltres package, which we know has been a lot worse since we lost like Viridian and that sort of thing. So probably not worth the experimentation. Just play Eternatus kind of like as it is right now, maybe with the Umbreon package, and sort of see how that goes. If you gets popular enough, maybe there's a reason to play this.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Dragapult. Dragapult, I think, has ended this format as basically the number 1 point earner. So it would be naturally in that tier 1. We think it's going to drop down to about 1.5. Mew is not a very tanky deck, but Dragapult is not a very aggressive deck. So Mew kind of is able to do this kind of strategy where they get a hit in and then can shuffle themselves back in the deck, get a hit in, shuffle themselves back into the deck. And because you can't Inteleon ping them either, you're basically capped at doing like 130 per turn against Mews, which Mew is completely fine with because it just gets to, even if it has to shuffle in every turn, it's just going to be able to wipe out all of your damage. Having fusion energy all over the board as well, like I say, is going to mean the Inteleon damage isn't doing anything. So it's literally just going to be these 5 damage counters that kind of stick around every turn, which is just not enough, especially against a deck that can do 210. very consistently. So Mew is kind of an awkward one. Similarly, we already saw that Single Strike was a pretty bad matchup, provided they didn't either brick or start like Urshifu or whatever. Now there looks to be a new Single Strike deck, which is pure Dark, which is obviously just a complete write-off for you, basically, because it's taken all of the good parts that you wanted to see in Single Strike and just stripped them out for more bad parts. So that's two really bad matchups. But we've already mentioned that the Urshifu matchup, the Urshifu Melanie matchup is pretty strong. So I think there's still that going for it, as well as I mentioned earlier on, how Dragapult somewhat gatekept Lotads here and there a little bit. That can still happen. So there's still two very good matchups in the upper echelons of the format, as well as still being a fairly strong deck against basically any Inteleon deck, because you're able to deal with their Sobbles earlier than other decks. There's a lot less appeal to decks like this and Jolteon, which try and apply pressure to the bench rather than the active, because we like this format looks to move away a little bit from the Inteleon engines, but there certainly will be still enough around for you to be able to punish them. So we still think it's like a really strong pick if you're hoping to hit like the latter, like the bottom half of 1 and 1 point, and then into like the 1.5 ranges. But I think having a bad Mew and naturally Single Strike still being strong, and maybe even going up in percentage points just because they're playing kind of two different decks now, is going to mean it's nowhere near as I don't want to call the deck oppressive, because I don't feel it has been oppressive, but it has been kind of the most consistent or most played deck, and I think that's going to cap it from being being like the same force in this format. I still think it's probably its other like big kind of win condition against things like Mew will be trying to like Marnie path them or even Hammer path them and stuff like that. So Mew isn't like completely unwinnable, but naturally if they can just draw out of your paths and stuff, which it's not anything kind of surprising for them. They're going to be building towards that anyway, so it's gonna take some kind of luck on your side or unluck on their side, I guess. So I still think it's probably going to be unfavorable, even with the Marnie path Hammer kind of strategy that I think Dragapult has to take going into that matchup. But yeah, it's winnable, but I think it's awkward, and I think that's going to be what caps Dragapult's success from that 1 down to that 1.5 that we've seen over the past few months.
Yeah, I think that's my biggest sort of sad violin, is that I think Dragapult probably should be playing Crushing Hammer going into this format, and that just makes me sad, to be honest. Let's look at another Suicune build. Let's talk about Ice Rider. There was times in the Evolving Skies format where I thought Ice Rider was a clear pick over Ludicolo, just because there was too much bench like targeting for the Lotads to actually get involved in the game, and I thought Ice Rider was like clearly a stronger choice. I think that actually flip-flops in this format, so we're going to be putting Suicune Ice Rider into tier 1.5. Obviously, there's the concern that there will be some Genesect-based builds, as you can see Gentox just alongside it, but also a lesser Sparkle naturally going into Mew decks means that Genesect can just manually power itself up. There's nothing wrong with them just going for turn 1 attach to Genesect Sparkle, and then they're always threatening, or even if they just attach a Genesect at any point in the game, they're threatening a Sparkle attached to just deal with an Ice Rider without the need for tablets, and that's a huge issue for you. Also, I just think that Ice Rider's math specifically is really, really reliant on Inteleon ping damage, and Mew just blocks that with their Fusion Strike energies. So I think that's a huge issue for Ice Rider when you're trying to set up these KOs for your late game push, and I just think that gets negated by Mew, and I think that would be like a big issue. So for me, I think there's a lot more sort of go face decks. Fusion Strike just only ever hitting the active, the Single Strike decks only ever hitting the active. That means that Ludicolo is probably going to be preferable going into this format at the very least, and then we sort of see how things go. That's not to say these two could flip-flop once again. We'll see how much aggressive Genesect decks there are. But right now, I think I'd prefer to be playing Ludicolo going into this format.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Sylveon. Sylveon's been a really interesting one. We think it's going to settle around that 1.5 tier. Again, I feel like it's kind of dipped between 1.5 and 2 maybe over the past couple of months. Essentially, it's just going to be this rainbow box, as it always has been, trying to hit as many things for weakness as possible. You've still got Blaziken, you've still got Urshifu, you've still got Moltres, so you can hit like a pretty wide range of the top tier decks to be able to keep up. It's just going to be, again, one of those situations where you kind of have to pick and choose based on the prior results. I'm still not the biggest fan of the deck. I'm I respect that it's done pretty well and better than I expected. I'll be the first to admit that I definitely underrated the deck going into this format, which is why I'm still respecting it to the point of giving it a 1.5 here. But it's just kind of not for me. But having that kind of box feel still could be a definite kind of win condition. I think me and Joe are both of the mindset that Sylveon is one of the worst cards in the Sylveon deck. There's less and less reason to be wanting to play the VMAX at the moment, I think. So I would see it as more of a rapid strike box as opposed to a Sylveon deck. But we've seen all of the correct types be partnered with Sylveon to some success. So we know it can work. It's just about whether you pick the right partners, hit the right matchups, and can succeed in that way. I think it has enough partners to be able to do that, and it can hit enough of these different decks in the upper tiers to be able to do that. It's just whether, I guess, on the day you're able to pick and choose the right ones to be playing. But I think it's still definitely a relevant deck, and like I say, I respect it a lot more than I did for the Evolving Skies meta, even though it's not to my playstyle or I'm not a particular fan. I think the deck definitely has merit.
Yeah, I think you're right there, and you can always just tinker with it to deal with what's the most popular. That's kind of like the main selling point, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's talk about another Hammer deck, actually. And I was just saying how Dragapult might need Hammers to survive. I still think Victini won't be surviving all that well. It has spiked a few tournaments in this format, and it does still have, good turn 2 tempo and has Hammer cheese factor to see you through. But I still think that that's kind of like all you have going for you. You have Genesect that you can sort of mop up that little bit easier against Fusion Strike and just sort of like one hit KO your way through them. And of course, you're going to try and path and hammer them out of the game. So maybe it's not your worst matchup coming into the format. I think you kind of prefer it to decks that will target down the likes of your Altaria in the opening stages. And although Mew can reach numbers onto the Victini, it's not like super easy for them to piece those combos together, especially if you are like disrupting them along the way. But I think there's still way too much Melanie-based decks. There's another water deck coming into the format in the form of Inteleon VMAX. Although they can't one-hit KO you, they get real close and then they just ping you down, which is maybe even worse for you than them just knocking you outright, because then they turn off your right hand even. So that could be a huge issue for you. And there's even more one-hit KO potential from Gengar coming into the format, and 310 is a real easy number for them. They just need the 3 energies and they get through you. So the tanking of Victini is not really there. And although hammers are effective and pretty reasonable into the Fusion Strike matchup, I think everything else in our sort of upper echelons are going to be really difficult for you to deal with as Victini overall.
Yeah. Let's talk about Jolteon, the other kind of big surprise or big successful deck in the early weeks of Evolving Skies. We still think this is going to be, again, around that 1.5 tier. Similar to Dragapult, both of these have been touted to be the best deck in format at a certain point. And I still think there's a lot to like about Jolteon. Again, similar to Dragapult, it can really punish Inteleon engines. It can really punish the Suicunes, which still look to be really good. But looking at some of these, some of the matchups on the in the S and 1 tier, Mew again can kind of employ that similar strategy to Dragapult, where it can just take the 100 hit and easily shuffle in. Obviously, the one thing to keep in mind with that is you are able to pretty effectively punish Genesects that don't have fusion energy on, because you can easily two-shot them with the VMAX attack, which is good, but which I think makes it slightly more favorable than something like Dragapult going into the Mew matchup, because you have that crumb ability side of things with Mew. With Marnie and Path, but also you can deal with Genesects provided they don't have a huge amount of, or they don't have access to fusion energy early. So it's a bit better than Dragapult, I think, but only slightly, because again they still have that tank ability, which is really annoying. There's still 3 or at least 2 fighting decks in tier 1, which you never want to see, because basically every instance that we've seen of the Urshifu decks has been incredibly favorable against the Jolteon stuff. Again, it kind of depends. You have to really punish their board state to be able to force them out of the game, rather than trying to outright win the game because they have too much. But they're just way too aggressive for you. But Suicune is still up there. And I think, again, you're pretty happy into a lot of these other 1.5 matchups as well. I initially thought Inteleon was a bit of a weird one because you have weakness, but they have healing. But the fact that you can punish their Inteleons, probably realistically more than they could punish your Inteleons, means that you are uh, favorable in that matchup, which initially I wasn't too sure of, just because I wasn't sure how the healing would work. I think the fact that you can deal with their engine and force them away from Cheryl means that you should overrun the Inteleon matchup, which is weird to think about because obviously you have weakness. So some people will have been like, obviously this is a free matchup because I have weakness on you. But then equally, some people will have thought of the other way where Inteleon gets to heal every turn, so how can Jolteon ever take prizes? I think it is Jolteon favored the more I think about it. So I think there's still a lot to like about Jolteon, and I think, again, similar to Dragapult, basically 1.5 down, you're still in a really, really good spot with a lot of these matchups. But again, similarly to Dragapult, there's a couple of new awkward aspects to some of these new archetypes that I think will keep Jolteon from being the reign of terror it once was on standard in the first couple of weeks of Evolving Skies.
Yeah, speaking of having a reign of terror in the opening weeks of Evolving Skies, Zacian Zamazenta was hugely popular at the beginning of the format. I think maybe just because of access for new archetypes and just wanting to keep playing with Zacian. But yeah, it has had a bit of a fall from grace, and we think that's only really going to be set to continue. I think just the natural like consistency of Zacian keeps it around that tier 2 and maybe relevant because Zamazenta's still reasonable. If Single Strike moves away from one blow, it becomes a significantly easier matchup for you. If they go Gengar based, because you can try and wall through them that little bit easier. So that's really the only like big change. Mew obviously has inbuilt wall breaking, which is an issue for you. They don't do a huge amount of damage, but they can scale that damage with tablets, and oftentimes they only really need to get through like 2 Zamazenta maximum, and they can also attack with Genesect quite easily because Zacian Zama will give them the time to do so, and they're more likely to be gusting you than the other way around because they just have far more draw than you do. So yeah, some of the new decks aren't ideal to come up against. Even the Inteleon deck with Cheryl, we at least play it with a high count of Path, and that would be a big issue for you. And obviously Genesect Toxicity, not one you'd want to face. So the new decks aren't exactly easy matchups, and we've seen that it's not really had enough to compete with the rest of the format right now. And there's not a big enough shift in the format where we think that's going to be changing too much. So yeah, you're kind of becoming more and more obscure, and we're moving it down to like the sort of 15th best deck, something like that, rather than one of the top 10.
Yeah. Uh, let's talk about Sableye Weezing. This is another of these kind of cult following decks. We still think it's like 2.5 era. I think it's better than things like not Dragapult, Decidueye and Duraludon because you can cheese games similarly to them, but also you have good typing, which is great. I actually think the Mew matchup is pretty funny for you because you have inbuilt ability lock as well as great typing on them. So it's kind of funny that I can't say I've committed to memory what the matchup would be like and tried to work out how favorable it is. But it is pretty funny that you're probably able to blow up Mews pretty easily. But realistically, this is one of these kind of cheese decks that will sometimes win off the back of Ascension turn 1 and sometimes just win off opponents missing enough turns because of Galarian Weezing to be able to take some prizes with the Sableye. So it's like, again, it feels like one of these 2.5 decks where if you really like it, it can win games. It's never going to be groundbreaking, but we've seen decks like this win tournaments before, so there has to be some small level of respect for it. It's better than some of these decks that we feel really you shouldn't be playing right now, but it's not a deck that either of us are particularly impressed by in terms of what it can do, to be honest.
No. And the last deck that we have on our tier list is going to be Shadow Rider Alchemy. We think this has, it's sort of peeped into the top 10 at times in the Evolving Skies format. And the Fusion Strike matchup, it's not going to be a path deck at least, but Fusion Strike is aggressive tempo. They are one of the best decks at turn 2 boss and hitting 210 like in the game. I think if they are either playing heavy gear, heavy boss, or they're playing peony cross switches plus bosses, all of that spells really bad news for a deck that wants to snowball and get stronger as you go. one thing to note is that the early game attack of the Shadow Rider V is actually pretty relevant because there's so much special energy around right now. It can maybe slow down a Mew potentially. And again, maybe trying to work in some fans or something like that in Shadow Rider could be a defense to slow down decks. But trying to find the space for all that is not the easiest, especially when you don't start drawing until you're into your VMAXs in the first place. So we're going to stick it in around that sort of tier 2 echelon where maybe now and then you'll see that cameo appearance where it turns up, and if it remains mostly, well, if Urshifu remains popular, which it sort of has picked up in play recently, you can do okay. You obviously don't want to see the likes of Gengar. Even the Suicune matchups aren't the easiest because they're just on the board quickly. But yeah, you still need to commit to all of these annoying things, like having 4 Stadium yourself, having all of your energy chucked in there. Alchemy is like a finishing attacker as a 1-1 or 2-2 line is still mandatory. So none of that really changes with Shadow Rider. You don't really gain any new cards that you can play in the set. You're just hoping that sometimes Fusion Strike, the deck list like misses boss, or that you can sort of block them in the opening stages with your early game V attack. Outside of that, I think you're going to struggle. And we've seen that there's just far better decks to be playing in the format right now, be it just because of Path Marnie in the opening stages, or just because there's too much dark inherently. Like Umbreon is just something you can't play around easily at all, because you're forced into your VMAX because of your energy attack costs on everything that you play. And I don't think that's going to be changing too much. I would still expect a ton of Umbreon going into this format.
Yep. So that's it. That's kind of our early tier list. Like Joe said, we've played a fair few games, so we feel like we're somewhat on top of how things are doing right now. But I'm sure we'll revisit this in a few weeks' time based on the results we've seen. But yeah, let us know whether there's any decks we've missed, anything you disagree with down below. Obviously, these are usually some of the more controversial or better discussion-based videos, so we want to hear it all down below. We'll also leave the link to the tier list down below as well, so make sure you share your completed tier list over in our Discord or on Twitter with us or whatever. We're really interested to see how you guys think these decks are going to rank up as well. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from Omnipoke, and we look forward to seeing you guys in another video soon.